Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Jacob Levy. I'm the coordinator of the research group on constitutional studies, which is a unit of the Yan P. Lin Center for the Study of Freedom and Global Orders in the Ancient and Modern Worlds. RGCS brings together scholars at all levels from across the university, mainly centered in political science, philosophy, and law, who study in a variety of ways and from a variety of methodological perspectives the values, institutions, and principles that organize and underlie societies and political and legal systems. It includes a group of some 20 faculty and postdoctoral fellows, a group of some 20 PhD and doctoral students, and a group of 20 undergraduate and master's students who come together in a weekly reading group, the Charles Taylor Student Fellowship, about which I'll have a little bit more to say at the end of my remarks, at the end of the session. The RGCS lecture series invites leading scholars from the variety of disciplines with which RGCS comes into contact. Not only political science, philosophy, and law, but also neighboring areas in the social sciences and history, and people whose disciplinary perspectives cross those boundaries. Invites leading scholars to begin asking them to present their research on the values, institutions, and principles of a free society in a way that is broadly accessible to our majority student audience and population, on the principle that excellent researchers are, to an underappreciated degree, also excellent teachers. We ask them to come and be both of those things at once, and over again, they live up to the task and students live up to the subsequent expectation that they be able to engage with leading research that is conducted and presented at a high level. For today, it is my real delight to welcome to the RGCS lecture series, Avigail Eisenberg. Avigail Eisenberg is professor of political science and former chair of the Department of Political Science at the University of Victoria. She's co-founder of the Victoria Colloquium on Legal and Political Thought and the Victoria Consortium on Democratic Constitutionalism. She has many varied and deep connections to RGCS and our broad community here, among which are that her work has been, I think, one of the common points of inspiration and reference across a surprisingly wide number of the faculty, postdocs, and PhD students who over the years have spent time in and worked at RGCS. And here I have in mind, in particular, reconstructing political pluralism, which I think turns out to, I suspect that if you were able to do a heat map of citations of reconstructing political pluralism, Ferrier would turn out to be one of the world's hotspots for citations of that really wonderful book. She's the author of 2 monographs and the editor or co-editor of 8 books. Her 2 monographs are Reconstructing Political Pluralism, which, among its many virtues, served, as far as I'm concerned, as a rescue of one of my favorite traditions of political thought, that of the British pluralists of the early 20th century, from what had become by then a very narrow sense of the British pluralists' relevance to ongoing contemporary normative debates. A narrow path that was going to lead into a dead end before, I think, Eisenberg's reconstruction of the pluralist tradition really made it intellectually available again for debates that were going to be really central to political theory and political philosophy over the course of the 1990s and 2000s. Her subsequent monograph, Reasons of Identity, published by Oxford University Press, is a crucial work on the question of how identity claims and identitarian politics are heard and managed in political life, wisely and persuasively rejecting either the account that identity claims are subject to no inquiry and must therefore be accepted at face value whenever and however they're presented, or, maybe more importantly, that identity claims are subject to no rational inquiry and therefore should be disregarded in political life. And she works her way through a series of the most important and in various ways controversial and difficult, ways in which identity claims and categories raise central political questions, talking about how it is that they are and can be engaged with as reasons, and the ways in which those reasons then can shape, and ought to shape, our political and policy responses. She holds a BA from the University of Alberta, an MA and PhD from Queen's University. She has received the University of Victoria's Faculty of Social Science Research Excellence Award and a Rockefeller Fellowship at the Bellagio Center in Italy, as well as holding visiting professorships in a number of important institutions around the world. She is among, I think, Canada's most original and creative and, to connoisseurs, influential of political theorists, and I'm very happy to welcome her to RGCS today. Welcome.
Wow. So I am overwhelmed. Thank you so much. Thank you to the Lynn Center and McGill University for this wonderful invitation. Thank you to Jacob Levy for that fantastic introduction and for the invitation and for hosting me, and to Catherine Liu for also hosting me. I'm so happy to be here. I do love McGill. We spent a study leave in Montreal. Love Montreal. Very happy, super happy to see this place and to be in this place and to be with you, to tell you a little bit about a part of my research, which is going to be part of a new book that I'm writing at the moment. But I'm going to start off with something that I don't know a lot about, but I'm putting it out there bravely, hoping that someone very nice will know more about it, so that you'll see after the talk, maybe we can talk cooperatively about this. This is for those of you who know the interior of British Columbia, this is the beautiful shore of Lake Osoyoos in southern BC. This is the Inkmip winery, the cellars of the Inkmip winery. It's the first Indigenous-owned winery in North America. Inkmip is the brainchild of Chief Clarence Louis, who is the chief of the Osoyoos Indian Band. And he is CEO of the Osoyoos Indian Band Development Corporation, which manages NICMIP as well as many other businesses. So NICMIP is a successful business by any estimation. So if I go like this, there it is again. You can see the sort of the desert of the interior in the background. There are some of its wines, Pinot Noirs, Meritages, it's the interior of BC, and award-winning wines. And they're very proud of it, and they should be proud of it. It's a major source of employment in the area, employing more people than there are members of the Osoyoos Indian Band. It brings $25 million, just this particular business, in revenue to the band every year. And it's just one of many enterprises that Chief Clarence Louis is involved in. He's been chief of the Osoyoos Indian Band, not traditional governance, but in the Indian Band for 36 years. The profits that are generated by Inkmip are used to build, have been used to build a cultural center. They're used to build education programs. And of course, they're used to employ nearly everyone in the Osoyoos Indian Band who wants employment, as well as many people in the larger community. So Chief Louis, for anybody who knows of Chief Louis, is known as a character. He's someone who strongly believes that economic development and employment is the best path to strong Indigenous communities. In Louis's words, and here I quote, "It's the economic horse that pulls the social cart, not the other way around, whether it's on reserve or off." So today I want to talk about the origins of this idea. of the idea of the corporation on indigenous in indigenous communities. That is the idea to establish an indigenous business corporation in order to promote economic development and consolidate indigenous community. The idea at its origins and in its fullest expression was developed by a woman named Laura Kellogg, who is an Oneida First Nations legal and political activist in the 1910s and 20s. Kellogg was a scholar. She attended Barnard, where she heard lectures by Franz Boas, which greatly influenced her. She went to law school at Stanford, though she didn't complete. She took political science at University of Michigan. She took social work at the New York School of Philanthropy, which is Columbia's School of Social Work today. In 1912, she helped found the Society for American Indians, but then got kicked out a year later for impersonating a government official while investigating lease fraud in the Osage community in Oklahoma. She traveled extensively in Europe, and her trips were reported in many European papers at the time. In the US, she was involved in legal cases for Indigenous rights. She was an advocate for Indigenous self-government and had more than one appearance before the US Congress. So in other words, this is not someone who was idle. This is an extraordinarily accomplished Indigenous person. The other thing to know about Laura Kellogg is that she lived at one of the most difficult times for Indigenous people. Not that there weren't many difficult times, but in the decades of the 20th century, the first decades of the 20th century, American Indigenous people confronted 3 federal policies that were all aimed at destroying their way of life. One was in 1848, the establishment of the reservation system. So that was in the United States, and that happened in 1848. The second happened in 1879, which was the establishment of residential boarding schools for Indigenous children. And in 1887, there was the Dawes Severalty Act, which authorized federal and state governments to dismantle commonly held reservation land and allot it, that is, give it to individuals as fee simple private property. So whereas European and settler governments had once recognized Indigenous communities as sovereign and quasi-sovereign entities, by the turn of the century in the United States, they were described as a vanishing people, known mainly for their exotic customs and costumes. Kellogg was born into the first generation of people to grow up with these, Indigenous people to grow up with these 3 policies. During her lifetime, the Oneida homeland would be reduced from approximately 6 million acres to a 32-acre parcel. And even that small bit became the subject of an ownership dispute, eventually resolved in 1920 when federal courts ruled the parcel to be the rightful possession of the Oneida people who lived on it. But of course, the Oneida people who lived on it were aggressively kept from living on it by the settlers in the area. So I don't know that any of them ever lived on it for years after the decision. In 1920, at the end of the Progressive Era, and so the Progressive Era, for those of you who don't know, is an era in American history where people who were progressives, they were interested in reform. They were reacting to industrial poverty, rapid industrialization, rapid urbanization, and all the social ills that came with that. Progressives were social reformers. And so they were, there was a progressive era, I guess it was from the 1890s to the 1920s. And during this time, Kellogg grew up. So when she was about 40 in 1920, she published a book called Our Democracy and the American Indian, which I'm sure is in McGill Library. You can take a look at it. It's really interesting. In which he proposed to use the law of incorporation to consolidate Indigenous community and establish something, and here I quote from her, something in the order of a self-governing community. She called this her Lolomi Plan. And the Lolomi Plan would establish collectively owned indigenous industrial villages on the model of a joint stock corporation and on the site of Indian reservations. It would be a business corporation and a cooperatively run community. So Kellogg proposed to use the law of incorporation to shield Indigenous communities from hostile government policy and corrupt practices. She described the plan as Indian communism because these villages and business corporations would be cooperatively run and egalitarian. So Kellogg's political ideas have received modest scholarly recognition. When people write about her, it's often to discuss her amazing life, which is truly amazing, and her fierce rhetoric, which is truly fierce. I'm going to quote from some of it. Politically, she has recently been recognized as an early advocate of contemporary sounding ideas about decolonization and self-government. Her project has been recognized as, quote, a systematic project aimed at Indigenous self-government, a proposal for, quote, decolonial democracy, which would dismantle settler colonial structures and reanimate values and practices considered integral to the resurgence of Indigenous social, cultural, and political forms. And if you read her, you can fully understand why that would be a characterization, one characterization of what she's doing. But here I want to build on this scholarship, but depart from its conclusion. My concern is that to read Kellogg's plan as a way for the Oneida to secure self-government is misleading in two respects. First, doing so suggests a misleading understanding of the relations between corporations and Indigenous communities. And second, doing so obscures Kellogg's significant insights about using incorporation to rebuild communities by which at the time were being destroyed. This was a decolonial project, but only in the sense that it was a method to save Indigenous community from complete devastation, rather than an idea that could overcome colonial relations. Now, Kellogg's idea to incorporate Indigenous communities was an example of what we might call a politics of holding fast. That is, holding a community in place, withstanding colonialism and racism until times change. Holding fast may be, and here's my hypothesis that I don't really develop, but this is why I started the way I did, holding fast may be a pervasive practice amongst Indigenous communities who were otherwise thought to be pursuing self-government. But it is not the same as self-government. Incorporation offered Kellogg, at best, a distorting and risky template for Indigenous self-government. But it was a brilliant idea because corporations mimic features of self-government. But as I'm going to argue here, they do so in deceptive and misleading ways. So the presentation has three parts. The first part, I'm going to tell you about the Lolomi Corporation, her idea, which, by the way, was never implemented, and why it made such good sense at the time and might still make good sense today. There are three aspects of the Lolomi Corporation that I'm going to highlight. One is the way in which it imposed borders and membership rules, the way in which it provided a context for the redevelopment of Indigenous education at a time when residential schools were assimilating Indigenous people. And third, it provided a context to create a revitalized economy. The next part of the presentation will look at the corporation as a self-governing community and what sense we can make out of that. And then finally, I'll conclude by returning to the politics of holding fast to consider what role that politics might play in colonial relations. So, the Lolomi Corporation. So let me say just a little bit about corporations for those of you who don't know about corporations. Corporations as a legal method. Incorporation is a means by which a person or group of people can exist as a legal entity. That's the main thing about corporations. So corporations create a legal fiction or an artifice that denotes personhood, independent of and irreducible to a collective's members or owners or managers. This legal person can be recognized in law and by the state and other corporations as capable of bearing certain rights and responsibilities, such as owning property and entering binding contracts. Unlike a partnership or a sole proprietorship, which has no legal existence apart from the people involved in it, a corporation is, again, an artificial person. It's independent of and irreducible to its members. It's liable as an entity separately from its members. So corporations have been described as extensions of sovereign power, with an independence like the state and a protective shield similar to sovereign authority, with which a corporation governs itself without outside interference and according to its chosen practices. So just like states, corporations enjoy perpetual succession, which allows them to exist as legal entities even if their members change. Incorporation is a means by which a group can protect its collective assets, importantly, because assets are controlled by the corporation, not by individual members. So individual members can't sell the assets of a corporation, even though they're a member of a corporation. Corporations can also be closed communities, in the sense that their membership is regulated by their own rules. The corporation also has authority to regulate its internal affairs, to such a degree that today, as Elizabeth Anderson has argued, they have been called private governments with sweeping legal authority over their workers within and outside the workplace. Now, perhaps the chief attraction for Kellogg was that the incorporation would protect the community's collective assets, especially indigenous land, which would be controlled by the corporation, not individual members. According to her proposal, village lands would be owned by the corporate entity and purchased outright by pooling the resources of community members, who would then own shares in the corporation. The corporation would be governed by a board of directors and protected as a corporation under federal authority. This would allow indigenous communities to be legally protected as collective autonomous entities in charge of their own local affairs. As a corporation, an indigenous community could defend its land from allotment and unconstitutional land grabs by state governments, which is exactly what was going on in New York State at the time. As a corporate asset, land could be sold only with the permission of the corporation's governing body. Because the corporation owned the land, it would also be taxed on the appreciation of its assets and its profits. So the corporation would own land in a fee simple sense, but it would be owned by the corporation. Now, prospective members would join Lolomi voluntarily by each making a small investment. Their liability for debts and losses would be limited to the sum equivalent of the value of the shares they invested. So this is called the joint stock model. And this joint stock model has attracted investors since the 17th century because it's allowed corporate entities to raise capital for large-scale enterprises without having to rely on a single benefactor or a small group of wealthy investors. The East India Company was a famous joint stock corporation, probably the first corporation, right? First joint stock corporation. Now, for Kellogg, the joint stock model offered a chance to build a whole village, with an industry, by raising funds amongst people that had next to nothing. So they had very few means, and they could pool their resources and do this. These corporations were meant to be livable communities. So Kellogg had visited garden cities in England and Germany, from which he developed ideas about community layout. The community would have a school, and at the center, a community center. And then there would be separate houses around the community center, each with its own gardens for each family. And then behind them, there would be places of work. There would be industry or farms. So people who would live in the same community that they worked in. Lomi communities would be run as a business It would have to be economically viable, and the economies would sustain the community and allow it to be self-reliant. Now, Kellogg's plan received a lot of attention at the time. New York papers reviewed it, discussed it. One reviewer praised it for its potential to lead 300,000 Indigenous people out of the bondage of bureaucracy into the self-respect of complete self-government. That's how it was described. But it was very controversial amongst Indigenous people. So some Indigenous people opposed resurrecting village life and instead favored the progressive values, the values of the progressive era. They valued self-reliance and entrepreneurship over cooperative living. Some people supported, Indigenous people supported allotting all reservation lands to Indigenous people as fee simple property and for Indigenous people to be recognized as American citizens. And that was a focus. Many Indigenous people opposed the corporate feature. So this is another aspect of the progressive era. They were very against monopolies and distrustful of corporations. So a lot of Indigenous people opposed the corporate aspect of the plan. They associated corporations with the worst excesses of capitalism. They supported the idea of collective self-government, but they were skeptical about building communities on reservation land, which was considered a site of poverty, confinement, and a reminder of dispossession. They liked Kellogg's idea because it circumvented the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which was like their DIAN, their Department of Indian, and it was the government, the federal government bureau that managed Indian affairs. But they suspected the corporate structure of Lolomi would have similar tendencies, and so they wanted nothing to do with it. Despite these objections, the plan made really good sense at the time. First, the corporation would establish community control over boundaries and membership. And that was a huge thing given the diversity of views within the Oneida community at the time. And within many Indigenous communities who were being pulled by progressivist values and pulled and impoverished, and it was all over the place. The politics of these communities were disintegrating. And so the politics was understandably all over the place. But what the corporation would do is that it would separate Indigenous people from white society, both through rules of membership. And then through voluntary segregation, it could separate Indigenous people committed to rebuilding community from those internal critics and internal assimilationists. So those who doubted Lolomi would not be inclined to join or invest in the community. By physically separating people in that way, people within the community and people outside, and I'm not just talking about settler and Indigenous, I'm talking about Indigenous people who were in favor of that collective life and people who were skeptical of it. By physically separating people, the corporation would erect an obstacle to a notorious and especially virulent kind of racism that dominated the time, which held that cultures exist on a civilizational scale, from savage to civilized. We're quite familiar with this, and that cultural difference has biological roots. Kellogg attended a series of famous lectures by Franz Boas in 1907 in which Boas debunked scientific racism. For Indigenous people, one of the most pernicious effects of this kind of racism was to support a self-congratulatory account of Indigenous assimilation as ethical and virtuous, and a romanticized and exoticized view of Indigenous ways of life that masked a relationship of complete domination. For white society, a paternalistic affection towards Indigenous people sustained a civilizational mission at the time, according to which dispossession had a benevolent intent and justified policies such as allotment. Allotment was contrived, that is, distributing land to individual landowners was partly contrived to drive these landowners eventually into debt, so that eventually they would be forced to sell and assimilate as laborers into the market. So Indigenous progressives supported measures for Indigenous assimilation. They argued for renegotiating the terms of Indigenous wardships, distributing all land as freehold, incorporating Indigenous children into white schools, and integrating Indigenous workers into a general market economy. Using the discourse of the progressives, they argued for detribalizing Indigenous people and self-help through immediate exposure to white norms to prepare Indigenous people for American citizenship. Those favoring assimilation would be unlikely to join or invest in the Indigenous corporation community that Kellogg wanted to build. Kellogg believed that incorporation would create a legal barrier to, quote, scammers and swindlers outside the community looking to profit from Indigenous poverty and desperation. It would also be a barrier to those Kellogg called unscrupulous Indians who through petty trickery sought to gain control over community members and land so that they could sell this land to someone else. The corporation would create a social bubble to preserve likeness in kind of the community, which Kellogg argued was crucial to the success of any cooperative project. Preserving that collective aspect was central to Indigenous survival in her view. Keeping it intact, that's what she talked about. Keeping it intact gives a chance for a better day to arrive, while the dismemberment of the Indian domain puts the Indian out into the labor world of the white man, landless. So control over membership and Indigenous land was key to collective security and could be protected through the corporate form. Second, Lomi was an opportunity to revitalize education or to make education the center of Indigenous community life. So Kellogg had worked as a teacher and was a critic of residential schooling, not only because of its assimilationist project, but also because of its dysfunctional nature, which was well known at the time, and it was well known by Indigenous people, and it was well known by settlers. The idea of residential schools was advocated and pursued, but the reality is everybody knew that these schools were pretty dysfunctional. Using the work of Simon Patton, a progressive economist who taught at New York School of Philanthropy, Kellogg argued before the Society for American Indians that different racial outcomes in educational achievement are the result of different opportunities, not different inherent aptitudes. Residential schools withheld opportunity, and that was the problem from Indigenous children. They violated child labor laws by requiring Indigenous children to work half days as housekeepers and farmhands and blacksmiths to offset the cost of the schools. And this is all documented by Kellogg. The schools were overcrowded, and this is stuff we know, or we should know, which led to outbreaks of disease for which the children received poor care. The Bureau's solution was to shut down the schools once they became notoriously dysfunctional, publicly dysfunctional. But they would do that and then move the children further away from their home communities. Now, of course, residential schools were also well-known instruments of assimilation. Some members of the Society for American Indians also agreed with Kellogg that the schools should be shut down. But they proposed that the move at the time was to take the Indigenous children in those schools and put them into white schools. And so faced with this dysfunction on the one hand and the threat of the solution being for the kids to go, Indigenous kids to go to white schools as a solution that was seriously considered, Kellogg's counterproposal was to bring schooling into Indigenous communities and redesign the curriculum to be Indigenous-centered and experiential. Amongst Indigenous people, she was likely one of the first advocates of community-based education. She argued that Indigenous ideas could offer knowledge, perspective, an educated sense of things, and an advanced philosophy of life based on experiences of living in the wilderness and old Indian oratory, which is oral history, which is noted, as she said, for profound thought, literary merit, and logic. Kinship was a central element of these arguments. Kellogg argued that one aim of the Bureau of Indian Affairs education policies was to civilize the race youth by denouncing his parents, his customs, his people, wholesale, and filling the vacuum they created with their vulgar notions of what constituted civilization. So at a time when progressive educators such as John Dewey and Simon Patton condemned assimilationist education for alienating immigrant children from their parents, Kellogg argued, and from the ideas within their culture, Kellogg argued for a community-based education for Indigenous children to ensure that they could study their own ideas and their own problems without isolating themselves from the broader community or from quote-unquote modern ideas. Indigenous schools in Indigenous communities like Lolomi were meant to bring new ideas to bear on Indigenous historical traditions and experiences, and to change and perhaps challenge these traditions, according to her. Third, Kellogg insisted that Lolomi communities must be places of work and industry, and that's actually one of the central aspects of them. This is quoting from her, "The structure upon which all these things depend is an economic one. The corporation, she believed, would renew Indigenous industry. And it would do this in three ways. First, it would shield Indigenous people from the despotism and immediate chaos of the capitalist wage system, which Kellogg wrote about. Lolomi businesses would not be committed to developing bigger machines or larger factories or sweatshops, which Kellogg argued led to child labor, industrial accidents, unsanitary conditions, long hours of employment, but were characteristic of the capitalist system around her. Work in Lolomi communities would be, she said, a pleasure, where each one wanted to give his best. Now, this might sound like socialist utopianism. I mean, it was socialist utopianism, but Kellogg's account of economic production and work was not short of detail about how these ideas could become reality. Communities would be working cooperatives in which members would become initially invested by pooling their resources in exchange for membership and shares in the community. For those who had no resources, they could trade their labor for credit. And for all of these people, social pressure and fear of not contributing one's fair share, she believed, would encourage members to work efficiently, to ensure self-sufficiency and community survival. The corporate nature of Lolomi helped to realize the cooperative norms by shielding workers from extrinsic motivators, such as the adversarial relations of the market, which reward individual opportunistic behavior and incentivize free riders. Second, also on the economic theme, Kellogg believed that corporations could help develop a community of disciplined workers. As theorists of corporations today argue, competitive markets can crowd out norms of reciprocity which exist within a corporation and which help those within corporations to organize, coordinate, and orient work. Marx had recognized this feature of the corporation, and for this reason, he argued that although corporations' cooperative socialization allows capitalists to extract more labor power from workers, it also enables a disciplined working class to emerge from corporations capable of operating together. Kellogg counted on these cooperative norms, but she also augmented their effects with added incentives. She had studied the Mormon communities of Upper New York State and noted that they succeeded because of social pressure and cooperative values generated by their economic model. So what happened in these Mormon communities, is they often established themselves with the help of a cooperative store that advanced new members' credit on an annual basis and kept track of their wages and labor. Members would then pay off their accounts with the wages they earned. And if they had wages left over, they would be credited shares of stock in the corporation. And if they fell behind, they would be asked to leave the community. So Lolomi communities would exert social control over their members. These were not just sort of the utopian kind of let's all hang out and work. They would adopt familiar socialistic principles of compensation and labor organization. The communities would place each member where they could do the most effective work, and members would earn salaries based on the kind of work they did, kind of like the model of the kibbutz. Compensation for different kinds of work would be transparent and distributed according to merit. And beyond this, the common wealth generated by the corporation, the community, would be socialistically shared. Finally, the third economic aspect is the corporation was a safe way for Indigenous people to integrate into white society. And I use integrate, and I'm not sure I like using that word in this way, but they could integrate into white society without being drawn into assimilation or stifled by isolation. The shield of incorporation gave the community capacity to interact with outsiders through the market. So Kellogg believed market competition would be advantageous for Indigenous people due to their natural clannishness, egalitarianism, and openness to outside ideas. She argued that Indigenous people had natural ties to the land, which was an asset. They had a strong social fabric due to their cultural collectivism. They could teach the white man the benefits of group cooperation and equal economic justice for all. At the same time, she argued that market competition would have benefits for the community. It would require Indigenous people to reorganize their holdings into a system of economic advantages. They would convert their reservations into industrial centers where they would modernize their affairs while being assured comfortable maintenance as long as they worked. Quote, I believe in struggle and competition with the outside world. Struggle is the making of men. Very progressivist values. So in sum, Kellogg discovered through the corporation a way to shield Indigenous people from colonial policies and white society. It's a joint stock company allowed Indigenous people to acquire infrastructure of a working community despite their moderate means. It provided a way to address an Indigenous person's lack of credit and fate as an exploited laborer in the capitalist market. Lolomi would convert the wastes of the reservation into industrial centers. It promised collective, not just individual empowerment without relying on government investment or handout. This thing, she argued, this thing I propose, is a hard-headed practical scheme, which is not dependent upon charity to carry it out. Crucially, no one had to ask the federal government permission to do this. No one had to negotiate a treaty. No one had to do anything. You just incorporate. So the corporation, with its membership rules, voluntary separation, community-based education, and economic revitalization orchestrated by collective and cooperative effort, was a pragmatic and effective alternative to convincing white settlers to suspend belief in their own greatness, or convincing a powerless group to relinquish their internalized inferiority at a time when their land was gone, their communities fragmented, their institutions nearly all broken, and their languages and ways of life no longer intergenerationally inherited. The promise of community and work within an Indigenous-run corporation could have enticed many Indigenous people, who then would become invested in the project of community making, of reconstituting norms of identity, and learning to rearticulate place-based perspectives that situated their community within the world. From this place, they could reestablish practices of social cooperation, which the community had, she claimed, albeit ones that secured the community's capacity to compete in the market. Cooperation would be prompted by social pressure, while sharing and egalitarian values would inform the community's basic rules. In these many respects, Lolomi was a brilliant plan to reinvent Indigenous community using the law of incorporation at a time when these communities were being destroyed. But was that self-government? So, to reinvent community, according to Kellogg's plan, is not the same as establishing a self-governing community, even though in important respects, the authority of a corporation mimics the authority of a sovereign state, and it empowers groups to be self-governing in limited ways. As I've said, corporate status allows a community to become an entity capable of entering contracts with rights under federal and state law, to manage its internal affairs according to chosen governing principles, with the expectation that its contracts will be honored and its assets protected and defended in state courts, regardless of its status in the social sphere. For an indigenous community in the 1920s in the United States, incorporation was a way to overcome the subordinate and precarious status of a colonized people and replace it in the market with that of a contractor, with equal standing and equal legal protection as a corporation. Incorporation substitutes contract arrangements for status arrangements, releasing communities from their subordinate status, at least in the market. They do what Milton Friedman said capitalist relations do, when he said that they reduce the extent to which particular religious, racial, or social groups must operate under special handicaps in respect of their economic activities. So incorporation ensures that indigenous people can participate in the market as consolidated collective entities like states rather than as individual laborers who are easily exploited. So neither individual laborers nor colonized collectivities. They're equal contractors. This contractual feature, however, also points to one drawback of incorporation and one reason why it's a poor substitute for indigenous self-government. Incorporation may keep a group intact by allowing groups to be recognized by other legal entities as legal persons. However, as a legal person, the corporation is stripped of its distinctiveness and the dynamic nature as a community. Within the language of contract, it becomes only possible to speak of a group as an individual, a legal person, rather than as a community with a distinct identity and set of values. So the virtue of corporate personhood, which is the opportunity to pursue economic development in the market as an equal legal person, is purchased at the cost of neutralizing the discourse of community and the differences amongst communities in a market context. In the absence of a language about community and community distinctiveness, corporate actors are legible to the state and to each other only as identical legal persons with the same state-mandated governance structures and legal duties. My colleague at UVic, Brad Bryan, explains with reference to contemporary indigenous business corporations that the creation of a corporate body excludes the distinctive governing structures of indigenous jurisdictional orders. And this is quoting from Brad's paper. Indigenous peoples' traditions of procuring livelihoods are transformed into forms inscribed by law so as to be legible to contemporary liberal legal orders. This making legible of indigenous people as legal persons obscures the formation of specifically indigenous legal subjects by mirroring and representing the sui generis Indian or native, and in doing so it forecloses upon possible expressions of indigenous legal orders. As market actors, incorporated communities may still be able to retain their authentic traditions and practices as part of their internal governance structures, or they can establish separate governance structures so they have two governance structures. And in fact, today what many communities do, and I'm sure this is true of the Osoyoos Indian Band Corporation, but I haven't looked into it yet, but what many indigenous communities do with community corporations is that they establish a traditional governance structure, or a governance structure that they're going to call the community governance structure, and they separate that and shield it from a structure by which the Indigenous corporation is run. But the appearance of self-government through chosen practices or these separate governing structures can be deceptive. The corporate entity must take on the power to manage, direct, and channel conduct as a corporate body. It's required by law to do so. It has to be able to direct its individual members and the lives of the community in ways that potentially amount to a fundamental reorganization of a way of life. Early 20th century market capitalism would require significant changes of Indigenous communities, albeit some changes that Kellogg welcomed. Kellogg recognized that incorporation would require restructuring Indigenous holdings, that is land, into a system of economic advantages. So land would become restructured as an economic advantage. It would convert reservations into industrial centers and modernize communities, even if these changes were not chosen by the community. These are predictable ways, which must lead us to the conclusion, and lead me to the conclusion, that incorporation may extend sovereign power into communities, but it does not empower Indigenous communities to be self-governing. Communities as corporations become indistinguishable from each other as quasi-sovereign powers. The difference between possessing sovereign power and being a self-governing community is partly reflected in the constraints on internal organization imposed on a community by incorporation. While corporations can structure their internal affairs and processes as they choose according to Indigenous values or traditions, all of their choices must be consistent with their ability to compete in the market. And where disputes arise, where conflicts exist between the decision-making of a traditional government and the duties of the legal person, the duties of the legal person is the only thing that the state recognizes in court, and that's exactly what happens today in our courts when there's a dispute between the traditional governance and the corporation within an Indigenous community. The state does not recognize the traditional governance. In this way, Brian concludes, Indigenous corporate bodies become inescapably subjects of the state and extensions of colonial rule. Now, had Kellogg actually sought to advocate self-government for Indigenous people, she would have something more than in the order of self-government, self-government. She could have turned to the long history of treaty amongst the Haudenosaunee rather than incorporation. Treaty is a central practice within Haudenosaunee politics and an important part of the history by which the 5 and then 6 nations of the Iroquois Confederacy united. And that is a history that Kellogg knew well. She had learned it growing up because she didn't go to residential schools, and she talked about that in her writing. And she, at the beginning of her book, like relations between corporations, a treaty relation is based on an agreement between different parties and is sometimes mistakenly understood as a contract between sovereign entities. But unlike contract, treaty is a relation of recognition between dynamic and complex entities which influence each other through their continuous interaction. In contrast, contract stipulates terms between two parties enforced by a third party with authority over them, because you need someone to adjudicate your disputes. Treaties set out terms by which to establish mutual respect that can be recognized and reciprocated. They are what Kirsch calls an interface between self-governing orders, by which the distinctive practices and traditions of each order can be understood and respected by the other order. For this reason, the treaty relationship is sometimes described as a living relationship, which communities enter without fully knowing where it leads, in which they agree to be guided by dialogue, to establish mutual understanding in light of rather than despite their collective differences, to acknowledge interdependence through reciprocity and cultivate mutual trust and mutual aid as required for peaceful relations. These are not utopian characteristics. Instead, they characterized a different kind of integrative relationship. Contracts are designed to constrain harmful action by establishing mutual agreement for the enforcement and adjudication of disputes by a third party, usually the state. By relying on the state as a third-party arbiter, the contract relation replaces the need for contracting parties to develop more substantive, meaningful relations with each other. Contractual relations allow parties to interact peacefully in a context of mutual distrust. They neither establish more substantive relations, that is, friendship or mutual respect, nor are they a method by which to do so. For this reason, faculty here and one of my colleagues from UVic, one of the people who came out of UVic, Aaron Mills, argues contract creates an artificial and shallow peace. It's a device to stipulate the terms of interaction between strangers, enforced by the state to facilitate limited kinds of exchange and cooperation free of conflict. As Mills writes, instead of universality, abstraction, formality, and certainty of rights established through contract and policed by a sovereign, in the treaty relationship, citizen behavior is conditioned by substantive living bundles of responsibility that empower and constrain the sharing of gifts. According to Mills, the point of treaty is to create the right relation that will be resilient in the face of conflict. And the resiliency of this relation allows treaties to exist in the absence of sovereign power that adjudicates conflicts between treaty partners. So within Haudenosaunee tradition, which was well known to Kellogg again, the treaty is a relationship to promote mutual understanding by keeping paths free of briars, as Haudenosaunee negotiators would explain during negotiations. Repeated interaction, recurrent deliberation, and the promise of mutual aid are fundamental components of managing that kind of integrating relationship. The language of sovereignty is in tension with this treaty partnership, which is an acknowledgement of mutual interdependence through relations of recognition and a reliance on the other party to respect the relation. Also, unlike contract, which relies on the state for enforcement, treaty partners must uphold their own treaties or agree to relinquish this crucial part of their relationship to third-party arbitrators. So in contrast to contracts, the treaty framework requires mutual recognition and the uncertainty about what the future holds. It's a social relation, a living relation, but it's also a very fragile relation. And that's actually a very interesting part of the treaty relation. It's not like a contract where you can get the courts doing it and can get the police on it. And like even contracts are not very resilient, by the way. So, okay, so let me just conclude. Yes, let me conclude. So Kellogg begins her book describing the treaty relationship that has been lost. And as my colleague at University of Michigan, who's written about her, David Temin, describes it, she constructs a counter politics grounded in a claim to belong to a confederated, multinational political order, namely the United States, which is rooted in treaty relations amongst sovereign nations, but which has disavowed the Haudenosaunee Confederacy. She offers a poignant account of what Iris Young calls relational self-determination, according to which the legitimate sovereign authority of the United States, or the legitimate authority of the United States, I would say, is compromised by its disavowal of the treaty relationship. For decades, the Oneida National Committee called on treaties to affirm their rights, and in 1920, with the founding of the League of Nations by Woodrow Wilson, some Indigenous leaders hoped that as an organized, self-governing people, the Six Nations would be recognized as members of the League. In this context, at this time, it's nearly impossible to believe that Kellogg intended Lolomi to fulfill these aspirations. Hers was a plan to escape colonial subjugation, crafted in light of dashed hopes for a better resolution. Kellogg writes that white society has turned treaties into scraps of paper while preaching from the hilltops the self-determination of people and the democratization of the whole world. She characterizes American federalism as based on the treaty relationship and the American Constitution as conceived to be a partnership between the Haudenosaunee and white settlers, but she argues none of these partnerships remain intact. Colonialism has made a myth of white supremacy colonialism has made the myth of white supremacy into a reality. A whole people, and here's quoting from her, who were the richest in possessions are reduced to vagabonds begging at the door of a sham civilization. Lolomi was meant to secure something in the order of self-government at a time when genuine self-government was impossible and when many Indigenous leaders had turned from their traditions. It would have allowed an Indigenous community control over membership, protection from the creep of assimilation, security for land and assets, a chance to rebuild social institutions and to make communities economically self-sufficient while being connected to the broader society and market. Incorporation mimicked features of self-government through legal measures of control over internal and external relations. Lolomi provided protection through a set of political hopes and market possibilities that progressives enthusiastically adopted at a time. Kellogg presented Lolomi as an opportunity to rebuild a broken people, is how she put it, without having to wait for white society to abandon its racism or for colonial policies to be rescinded. It was a form of self-help at a time when communities were being destroyed. As a legal tool, incorporation was a way to hold fast, to keep Indigenous land and community intact amidst policies designed to fragment and corrode community through loss of land, debt, and poverty. Lolomi would create a status by which Indigenous people could escape economic isolation without abandoning their communities. It would create external relations between entities that would each be regarded as legal persons by the state, and the state would be required to enforce the legal obligations of these entities to recognize each other's legal status as legal persons and to honor their agreements, but nothing more. This was a plan to hold fast, to withstand circumstances which at the time were not likely to change soon. By the 1920s, the United States government had long abandoned the treaty relationship as a means of interacting with Indigenous people. State and federal officials, whether conservative or liberal, racist or progressive, were invested in policies like residential schools and fee simple property relations that assimilated people with benevolent intent. In this context, Kellogg's plan was a way to withstand the pull of assimilation and protect Indigenous people from the subaltern relation entrenched through a civilizational myth. As a model for organizing Indigenous life, incorporation would hold the place of tribes as healthy, livable communities. The corporation was a compromise, albeit a sustainable compromise to community disintegration. The politics of holding fast is neither an antidote to colonialism nor a template for Indigenous self-government or self-determination. And I think if we forget that, we forget what the goal is, the ideal is. But it may be how self-government is misunderstood today. As Kellogg's efforts demonstrate, Indigenous communities adopt strategies like incorporation because there's no better choices before them. For those who understand such strategies as holding fast, the hope is that their community will be able to move beyond what is meant to be a temporary place and that they should be ready. That said, holding fast is not part of a politics of defeat, assimilation, or co-optation. To hold fast in the face of what is the rule of another people over you is not impotence, but confidence in the resilience of your community and its capacity to withstand in seemingly impossible circumstances of the present. Of course, this is still a politics with great risk, the risk being that over time, strategy will become reality, and community members will come to prefer a position of compromise over more radical alternatives. Dealing with this risk is something that Kellogg never discussed, because of course the Lolomi plan, as she conceived it at least, was never implemented. Thank you. I actually have one more thing to say. We are on Haudenosaunee territory, and I want to acknowledge with deep respect that we are on the territory of the Haudenosaunee people. And in fact, when I was doing this and I was thinking about this presentation on the train over, I thought, what an honor it is. It is not only an honor to be here and at the Lynn Center at McGill and for you, but it is a great honor for me to be giving this paper on Haudenosaunee territory. And it's a very special moment for me. Thank you.
At the RGCS lectures, the first question is reserved for a member of the RGCS Charles Taylor Student Fellowship.
Thank you so much for your lecture. It's very, very wonderful, and I enjoyed it very, very much. I have two questions, whichever you would prefer to answer. One is the idea you talked about earlier in the talk. You talked about the social bubble and how they keep, like the Kellogg's plans to keep it sort of like likeness and kind. And that sort of reminds me of the Pier 1 Frog rule in the sense that to keep, and that's sort of like a colonial rule too, to keep people lower and lower in number. And I was just curious if that was, I guess, because I haven't read her book either, and I know in this context it's really hard to judge from our context, but I was wondering if that was something that was going on in her work. And the other thing is, I was curious as to the idea of like, if the member wasn't very productive, they would be kicked out of the community. And I was just curious as to, I guess, more details of the justification that she has for this. Because, for example, to the best of my knowledge, a lot of indigenous tradition would just like, if someone makes a mistake, it's sort of like a community teaching to reintegrate that person rather than to like disclose that person per se. So is there any more details into why to justify that? Yeah, thank you so much.
So your first question, am I understanding it correctly to think that you're wondering about whether, what importance she invested in people existing in this community who were like each other?
Yeah.
And, okay. So to answer the second question first, thank you very much. They're both great questions. So this person was not without her opinions that were independent of Haudenosaunee traditions. I want to, in the paper, portray her as someone who had a little bit of a fierce aspect to them, and also was confronted with a impossible kind of politics. So assimilation and community devastation and losing land, where people within your community are contributing to that devastation. That's how I'm imagining her mindset. And so, yeah, she was all into kicking people out. The Mormons were all into kicking people out. They just they wanted no truck or trade with people who wouldn't work in a very focused way for the community. So that's the answer to that question. I hope that's satisfactory. So the other question, it's interesting because she talks about, I'm doing research on 4 women, and she's one of them. And the other one is Ella Baker, and who was an African-American woman who initially was very interested in cooperatives. Black people in the United States had started lots of cooperatives at the time. And they had started them because they were, it helped cushion them from exploitation. And Ella Baker was a cooperative organizer, as were other people in the civil rights movement. But this is even in the 1910s and 20s. And Kellogg mentions these Black cooperatives and says, that's the problem with Black cooperatives. They weren't successful because they let white people in. And so it's likeness of kind. That's the only way in which cooperative behavior works. So there you go. Not an interracial community and not an interracial idea of cooperation.
Thank you, Sue. Next is Andrew, then Catherine.
I have a question about the distinction between company law and contract.
Right.
Speak up since there's not a handheld mic going around.
Oh, right. Question about the distinction between company law and contract. That seems to rely on some type of an impartial judge or whatever deciding that distinction should apply. So I'm thinking of all number of reasons why I might annul a incorporation document, right? So I could say, for example, that it's fraudulent, or that it's an attempt to get around rules about conspiracy or something like that. There are cases in the history of contract law and incorporation law that get you to that point. And I'm just curious what her defense of the distinction is. Like, is she relying upon settler judges to say, wait, this is a case of incorporation, this is not a case of fraud, and therefore we ought to honor the distinction between a treaty and a contract, with the background idea, of course, that the treaties they mostly ignore, and the contracts they mostly accept because they're within whatever type of legal system is dominant at the time. So I'm mostly curious about this distinction. What does she say is supposed to protect them from the idea that a settler judge might just say, I don't buy this incorporation. I think it's a vehicle for getting around the law, whatever they interpret the law to be, and I'm just going to ignore that.
Right. So, so if I've got your question correctly, it's about what stops us from being discriminated when we go before a court with a contract, if we're from a subaltern group, from a subjugated group. And good question. I mean, I don't know what stops that. Precedent? I mean, precedent stops it. I mean, all sorts of things. Obviously, the politics that we're living in right now suggests that nothing stops it. But nonetheless, I think that in her view, she is comparing the plight of indigenous laborers as individuals, right, to the to a situation where they would just be viewed as an incorporated entity, and a judge or even another business dealing with another corporation dealing with them might even not know they're indigenous, right? Like there's no marker. So in one sense, that the normal things of law would save us from being discriminated as contractors before a judge. Those are imperfect. But the colonial status of individuals is, I mean, this is what we're comparing it to. It's incredibly precarious. So in a world where you're choosing between enormous precarity, right, versus and lawlessness, by the way, too. So there's a lot of lawlessness in 1920s. If you read what was going on with the allotments and how they were taking allotted property away from indigenous people, like it was just like a free-for-all. But to incorporate and to have that sort of collective power and to establish what she thought was going to be industrial, like going businesses, that would just be a much more difficult, I think, situation, especially since contract has to be enforced by courts. So nothing, I mean, it would, and corporations would have standing before courts in a way that indigenous people on reserve didn't really have great standing before courts. So so, you know, just thinking, as I'm thinking through this answer, their standing would be better as contractors. They would be shielded by precedent. So how one corporation is treated has to be identical to another. None of these things are sure things. But, you know, NAFTA's not a sure thing. Borders are not a sure thing. I mean, this is in a context where tons of things are not sure things, right? So we're going for better rather than worse. Which is actually what, I mean, I say that in my answer to you, but, you know, that treaty relation that I described, it's very precarious, right? It's a very precarious and fragile relation. But that's the difference between contract and treaty. That's one of the differences.
The list is Catherine, Will, Justo, Saul.
Hi,
Hi, Catherine.
I really love that. That was such an interesting, fascinating talk, and I really love the argument too. I think I have two questions. One is, I wonder if there is a parallel that you could draw, or whether there are differences between Kellogg's attempt to, as you say, hold fast through incorporation, and the attempts at the same time of people like Chief Levy General the Six Nations, who goes to the League of Nations, where he tries to where he tries to blame Canada for having invaded the Six Nations and usurp governance. And one of the things I remember reading about something he said there was, he was asked, are you a member of the United Nations? And he said, well, I don't want to be part of the United Nations, but if I have to be in order to make this claim, then okay, I'm willing to become a recognized nation. Of course, this doesn't happen, right? And it's sort of there, but I wonder, I've always thought of what you said there as, that's not what we want. And in terms of our own self-government, it's not that we want to become a member of the League of Nations, but it's instrumental, right, for us attaining the level of self-determination we would need to. So I just wonder whether you think there's a parallel thing going on there. And then the second, and since he was denied, I sort of wondered about the indigenous incorporation attempts, whether they were denied, whether there were attempts anywhere else denied for various reasons. But the second question is maybe more a question about why you think that, I understand that she thought the treaty process, given her Haudenosaunee concept of Rwanda, was one of equality, whereas other possibilities were not, as you say, the corporation was not. But is there something fixed about these concepts that make them so? I mean, it seems to me that the basic problem of treaties in that period for indigenous people was how anomalously unequal they were, right? And then there's lots of treaties that clearly were not equal, and that's the anomaly of the treaty between the U.S. and indigenous peoples, which means that treaties just really don't have to be egalitarian, right? So I don't think there's anything about these concepts, and the corporation then makes me think, well, it's not that it has to have the problems that you identified, right? It's kind of flattening out and lack of a differentiation. I mean, there's a way we could conceptually think of a corporation that doesn't have these problems. It obviously depends on the politics of what kind of systems corporations are embedded in as entities. In a capitalist, perhaps, market system that we have, that's how it is. So I just wonder, how historicized these concepts are, and whether you're so committed to adopting or reading.
Oh, thank you, Catherine. That's a really intriguing question. So Duquesne, yeah, I probably agree with you. I probably think that this was, but I don't know enough to, what you say makes a lot of sense. That the League of Nations is instrumental, that's not exactly the relation, but that was closer to the relation. And so what also makes a lot of, the other aspect of this, and this is why I hesitate to say, yes, that's exactly what it is because it depends on what there's an individual story there too. There's Laura Kellogg, what she thought. There's Clarence Louis, Chief Clarence Louis, what he thinks, right? What is he doing? Is that a politics of holding fast, or is that a politics of co-optation? So that's why, yes, this is a hope to create a tool of research, actually, so that we can see differences in what is going on in different contexts, and not just call self-government agreements. That's not necessarily what's going on. And that we can, and this speaks to your second question, is that I might agree with you. I have to think about it, but I want to preserve the idea of the treaty relationship. So treaties are great and pervasive, and they're unequal. And by the way, in the 1920s, they were few and far between. This was not, the treaties had by that time they were just not discussed as a way forward. But the treaty relation is a fascinating thing that we are lucky to be able to hold on to. And maybe our world isn't actually the world in which that relation can take hold. But I think that what we find if you do history of ideas is that there are all these great ideas and concepts, and they just get lost in the ether. And the treaty relation, when reading Laura Kellogg, what I saw the treaty relation, that she was going for this idea of corporation, knowing that was not the treaty relation, and that the treaty relation that she was familiar with, the Haudenosaunee treaty relation, didn't come out in a positive way, like this is what we want, but this is what you took. This is what we can no longer have. So I don't know if that answers your second question, which I find a really interesting and rich question, but that's where I would go to with part of the answer. Thank you.
I'll ask our remaining questioners to stick to one question apiece.
Mine's sort of capacity.
Okay.
I'm actually withdrawing the question. Catherine covered the graph, so
Okay. Over to Tom.
Hi, thank you very much for your talk. It was really interesting. So I'm quite curious about Kellogg's conception of corporation, because typically in Western political thought, something that we see very frequently when the corporation is applied to a political or religious community is it's accompanied by a kind of like a bodily metaphor, like a metaphor about the human body. So, for example, like the body politic is an example, or the universal body of the Catholic Church is another example. And these typically also involve kind of normative arguments about how the different parts should function together, how they should maintain the health of the whole. And I was wondering if there was any of that in Kellogg's conception of corporation, and if not, is that due to some kind of incompatibility between this metaphor and Oneida political theory, or is there something else at play here?
So that's a really interesting, I never thought about that before, but you're right, there's an organicist element to talk about corporations, and you're right, it's nothing there. It's not discussed like that. She has no, she's really grounded in economics. So she's looking at cooperative economics, the way in which work creates social relation between people, which is as soft as she gets. She doesn't believe in kind of the organic metaphors of body and such. Yeah, interesting. Not at all.
Whereas the organic metaphors were talked about in the tradition of thinking about group life, about which Professor Eisenberg's first book was in part written.
That's very true. Yeah. Very true.
We have several pieces of concluding business. I'll ask you to stay up here for the beginning of the concluding business, and I'll ask you to hold these couple of things to start. Number 3.
Nada.
Wonderful. Come on up.
this is not right.
Oh, this is completely real.
You now hand her the book that you're holding.
This is very fascinating.
Okay, that then appropriately segues into a round of thank yous, because among the people we need to thank very much Nada Nasser, who does really crucial organizational work for these lectures, along with Jean-Félix Caron, the administrative coordinator of the Jan P. Lin Center. We also thank the Institute for Liberal Studies, a generous grant from which partly supports the RGCS lecture series. Since Nada is the one who's here, let's thank her again.